My name is Sooner Steve. We're delighted to have you with us here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for choosing Old Town Trolley Tours for your sightseeing needs. We really do appreciate your business. This tour is almost exactly 2.5 hours long. We begin and end right here where we started. We have 3 designated stops where you'll be able to get out, walk around, take pictures, and use the bathroom. In 1790, anybody was around that year? Anybody want to admit to that? 1790, Congress passed a bill called the Residence Act. The Residence Act of 1790 stipulates that a square of land not to exceed 10 miles on each boundary be set aside roughly in this area. And that 10-mile square was to become our permanent federal district, evermore known as the District of Columbia. On your right is Freedom Plaza. This is where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. began his famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. He met right here with other civil rights leaders, and together all of them marched down to the Lincoln Memorial, where we'll go later tonight. And there he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. It's the Willard InterContinental. That's a gorgeous French Second Empire architectural style. There's a lot of that around here. You've probably seen some other buildings that style. A lot of famous people have stayed at the Willard Hotel. Mae West, Harry Houdini, Mark Twain, President Lincoln, Chuck Norris. They've all stayed there. Vice President Calvin Coolidge lived in the Willard Hotel on the 3rd floor as Vice President. President Ulysses Grant used to come down to this hotel for drinks in the lobby with his friends. And they say he got so tired of people in the lobby asking him for presidential favors, he began calling them lobbyists. And they'll tell you that's where the term originated, right there at the Willard Hotel. Anybody remember a beautiful old hymn called the Battle Hymn of the Republic? Yeah. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. That song was written by a woman named Julia Ward Howe back in 1861 while she was staying at the Willard Hotel. At the top, it's 34 feet across, and at the bottom, the walls are like 15 feet thick, and at the top, they're only 18 inches thick. So the whole thing tapers all the way up inside and out. And right down the center of it is the elevator shaft. And on the 4 corners of the elevator shaft are 4 long steel rods or poles that go all the way from the cone at the top into the ground below, and they serve as part of its lightning rod system. So anytime lightning strikes the tip of the Washington Monument, the current is channeled down the 4 corners of the elevator shaft into the ground below. It's an amazing feat of engineering, but it evidently works because the Washington Monument is still standing after all these years, and it's standing perfectly erect as far as we know. We may talk more about that later. Do you know books have been written about the Washington Monument? The story of it is just almost too crazy to believe. Coming up on your right is the beautiful World War II Memorial. Really beautiful. It was dedicated in 2004. Tom Hanks had a big hand in its creation, as you may recall. The fountain, which you can see from here, is called the Rainbow Fountain. And right on the other side of it is the Freedom Wall. It's a short little wall with 4,048 gold stars embedded in its surface. Here's a view. Look at that, would you? The Jefferson Memorial in the evening sun. This body of water is called the Tidal Basin. It was built by the United States Army Corps of Engineers. Back when they were dredging the river to firm up the land around the base of the Washington Monument for its dedication, they decided to go ahead and create this tidal basin. It's part of a greater engineering project, which includes the Washington Channel over on the other side of the Jefferson Memorial. But the tidal basin is entirely man-made. It's about 10 feet deep. It holds roughly 250 million gallons of water, and it's fed by the rising and falling of the tide. When the tide comes in, it fills it up, and when the tide goes out, it drains into the Washington Channel, keeps yachts from foundering in the mud. Thomas Jefferson was a pretty witty guy. He said, "The man who reads nothing at all will be better educated than the man who reads only the newspaper." Thomas Jefferson was one of 3 of America's first 5 presidents who died on the 4th of July, our nation's birthday. Did you know that? John Adams, our second, Thomas Jefferson, our third, actually died on the same 4th of July, 1826, 50 years to the day from the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. We've arrived at our first stop of the night. There are 2 memorials at this stop. The first one is the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial. It was dedicated in 1997. It's very big, 7.5 acres, 200 yards long. It's divided into 4 sections, each section dedicated to one of the president's 4 terms. Franklin Roosevelt, I think you remember, was our longest-serving president, 12 years in office, the only president ever elected to more than 2 terms. He died just into his 4th term after leading the country through the Great Depression and much of the Second World War. His memorial on your right there, by the way, is the only presidential memorial in the city that also commemorates the life and work of a First Lady. There's a lovely statue in there of Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife and distant cousin, who was America's first delegate to the United Nations. The other memorial at this stop is up ahead. It's on your right, dedicated to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. In that speech, he quoted from the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson. When it came time to build a memorial for Dr. King, they chose this location, partly because it's on a direct line between the other 2 memorials. They call that the line of leadership, and it's part of the design concept. The 2 gigantic stones, which look like bookends, are called the Mountain of Despair. And out of the cleft in the mountain comes a 3rd stone, the Stone of Hope, into which Dr. King's 30-foot relief is carved. The address of this memorial is 1964 Independence Avenue. That's a numerical reference to the year the Civil Rights Act was passed, the same year Dr. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. His relief depicts him standing with his arms folded, holding a copy of his speech rolled up in his left hand, and he's gazing in the general direction of the Jefferson Memorial as if to hold President Jefferson accountable for his own words, the words he put in the Declaration of Independence, the same words Dr. King quoted in his speech. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The Lincoln Memorial this month actually will celebrate its 101st birthday. It was dedicated May 30th, 1922, and so last May we celebrated its 100th birthday, and they're planning to open up the cavern underneath the Lincoln Memorial and turn it into a new education center, gift shop, restroom area. That cavern, which you don't even realize is there, is called an undercroft, and it's literally 3 stories tall. Beneath the Lincoln Memorial, there are huge cement columns holding up the statue of President Abraham Lincoln. They're supporting his heavy statue. It's amazing how they worked all that out in terms of the engineering. But they're going to open that up at some point in the near future, and you'll be able to go down there and check it out. There are 36 columns at the Lincoln Memorial. They represent the 36 states that were members of the Union when President Lincoln was assassinated by that no-good scoundrel John Wilkes Booth. You can read the names of those states up above and between the columns, and then on the upper level, called the attic level, are the names of 48 states that were members of the Union when the memorial was dedicated in 1922. President Lincoln's statue inside, and his is a statue, is 19 feet tall, sitting. If he were standing up, he'd be about 28 feet tall. The battle for Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945. It lasted 35 days and became one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. military history. On the 4th day of fighting, several platoons of Marines climbed to the top of Mount Suribachi, an extinct volcano at the southern end of that little island. There they produced a tiny American flag, put it on a pole, and rammed it into the volcanic soil, claiming the island for the United States while the battle raged below. That little flag, however, was too small to suit the commanding officer down on the beach. He wanted a bigger flag up there that everyone could see. So the first flag was taken down, and the second larger flag was produced and raised by the 6 young men depicted in the statue on your left. At the base of the flagpole is Corporal Harlan Block from Texas. Behind him on this side is Private First Class Harold Keller from Iowa. Behind him on this side is Sergeant, let's see, with his rifle running vertically down his back is Sergeant Mike Strank from Pennsylvania. And behind him there with his hands not quite touching the pole is Private First Class Ira Hayes from Arizona. Around on the other side in front of Ira Hayes is Private First Class Franklin Sousley from Kentucky. And in front of him, around on this other side, is Private First Class Harold Schultz from Michigan. The photograph of the second flag raising of that day, as this is known, was taken by an Associated Press photographer named Joe Rosenthal. That photograph earned him a Pulitzer Prize, and it ultimately became the most reproduced photograph in the history of photography. It was also the primary model for this statue, which was created by a very talented sculptor named Felix de Weldon, who also happened to be a member of the U.S. Navy. When the photograph hit the front pages of newspapers in the States, President Franklin Roosevelt ordered all 6 of these flag raisers off the island immediately. His intention was to bring them all back to the States and put them to work raising money for the war effort. But by the time his order was received on Iwo Jima, 3 of them had been killed in action: Mike Strank, Harlan Block, and Franklin Sousley. Ironically, 2 of the remaining 3 who did actually come home early were not actually members of this group of flag raisers at all. They had been misidentified. But just so you'll know, the names I gave you are the corrected names. On May 5th, 1945, the United States military participated in the liberation of the Netherlands from Nazi occupation at the end of World War II. As a thank you for that participation, Queen Juliana of the Netherlands presented President Harry Truman with a tiny silver handbell as a down payment or a pledge for a gigantic, beautiful bell tower to come.
This is the Netherlands Carillon, one of the many monuments
bright, shining military stars back in the mid-1800s. He served as commandant at West Point Military Academy from 1852 to 55. And when the Civil War broke out in 1861, President Lincoln offered him command of the Union Army. He very famously declined, saying that he just could not bring himself to fight against his fellow Virginians. And so he and his wife, Mariana, the official owner of the plantation at Arlington, decided to abandon it. About that same time, the federal government levied a property tax against so-called rebel sympathizers living in this area. It was a tax that had to be paid in person, presumably to help them keep track of these so-called rebel sympathizers. When federal representatives came across the river to collect General Lee's tax, he was already gone fighting the war. His wife had left and sent a cousin back to pay that tax. Well, that was unacceptable to the federal government, and they used that as a rationale for confiscating the entire plantation for the amount of the unpaid tax, which totaled $92.07. They almost immediately began burying dead soldiers around the Lee mansion to teach General Lee a lesson. But it was a lesson that was lost on him because he never came back. General Lee died in 1870. His wife died 3 years later, and a few months after her death, their oldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, filed a lawsuit against the United States government for wrongful possession of his family's property. It took him 5 years of litigation, but he won. The Supreme Court gave him the property back. But by that time, there were about 16,000 graves in Arlington. And faced with having to remove all of those graves, the federal government asked Mr. Lee to name his price. They settled on an amount of $150,000 in cash, and that allowed the cemetery to remain where it is. It was officially dedicated in 1864, and since then, over 400,000 have been buried in Arlington National Cemetery. The Capitol building is the second oldest public building in the city after the White House. Construction began here on September 18, 1793. George Washington himself laid the cornerstone in a Masonic ceremony in the southeast corner of the Senate wing, which is up ahead on the north end to your right. The Senate wing was the first wing completed in 1800, followed by the House wing behind us on your right in 1811. For several years, there was nothing in between the two wings except a little wooden bridge connecting them, and it was that complex of the two buildings and the bridge that were burned by the British in 1814. Nothing you see of the Capitol today is original. It has been rebuilt and added on to many times since it was burned by the British. There's quite a bit of construction here on your right. This all belongs to Johns Hopkins University, but long ago there was a hotel right here on this corner. It was called Gadsby's Hotel. When Andrew Jackson was inaugurated to his first term as president back in 1829, he spent his last night as a private citizen right here at Gadsby's Hotel. The next day he got up, got dressed, went down to the Capitol building behind us, where he was sworn in as our 7th president. And then he led his own parade, as presidents do, to the White House straight ahead. And he was followed there that day by thousands of his friends and well-wishers, many of whom stayed so late into the night and got so drunk and rowdy that they started fighting and breaking the furniture in the White House. Well, the president was still grieving the recent death of his wife, Rachel, and at some point in the night, he said he'd had enough, and he supposedly sneaked out a window and rode his horse back down to Gadsby's Hotel, where he spent his first night in office. The next morning, his aides were finally able to lure his guests out of the White House by putting big tubs of whiskey and punch on the lawn. And like a moth to the flame, they were drawn to the drink, and they just locked the doors behind him and summoned the president back to work. You can't make this stuff up. In the Civil War, American soldiers did not wear dog tags. When they went into battle, they would often pin a little piece of paper on their blouse or shirt with their name written across it. So if they were killed, somebody would see their name and notify their family. Well, Clara Barton, who founded the American Red Cross in 1881, decided to create what she called a missing soldiers agency. And she and volunteers would helped track these guys down, soldiers that never came home from fighting in the Civil War. About 15 years ago, they were doing some work in this building here to your right on the second floor. They knocked out an interior wall, and they found a sign that said Missing Soldiers Agency, and determined this is where it was located, right here. In fact, she lived in this building, and her agency was at her apartment.